Hey everyone, it's Kate from Sleep Time Consulting and I am here today to talk about early rising after the clock change, and that's because I asked how you guys were getting on and you've come back to me and told me that some people are still suffering a little bit with early mornings. So I decided to do this video because I thought it was important that I kind of lay things out, explain a bit more about what you can do, because the funny thing about clock changes is, like, obviously we can't do anything about them, they're going to happen. Although I have heard in some countries, it was Turkey, that was it, they don't do the clock change, they just exist. You know, imagine that, the time doesn't change twice a year, and nothing bad happens, but we have to live with it and we have to kind of deal with our own situation. But I wanted to start off like going, I don't know, I was trying to think whether I'd been affected by it, and I think I have a little bit. I find my body clock's a little bit out of sorts, so it's easy for us to then to understand that it's kind of a little bit tricky for our little ones to understand what we're asking of them to sort of change the day. But it's happened and we need to work through it. So whether you've done anything in your routine beforehand, whether you did anything on the day, I'm going to talk today about what you can do to address any problems you're having with this kind of early rising situation, arguably due to the clock change, but also there's things that will be applying if you have an early riser anyway. I have seen some stories of people having children that were waking at 4, maybe waking at that 3 o'clock. So actually it's really important to kind of know and have a process to kind of work through. So as ever, hopefully quite simple, straightforward advice, and I'll run through it now. So the first thing I want to talk about is just ticking the boxes on the list. Just making sure that you have done everything on the sort of the super gentle sleep book kind of side of things to make sure there's not nothing obvious that's affecting them. So the key things within that are going to be the environment. So how dark is it? So we're talking about it getting lighter a bit earlier. There's some of the hours that we're talking about at the moment, probably not going to see sunlight at that point, but just make sure that your rooms are very dark, as dark as you can. My favourite recommendation is the travel blackout blind. That will cover kind of the corners and any light creep that you have, and just make sure you've got that consistently through the day. And that also, if you are having kind of more frequent naps or any problems with naps, is a really good tip to have in there as well. The other thing is thinking about how cold it is. Now it's cold today, and that's kind of not necessarily going to change that much. We're into that kind of autumny, wintry season. So think about whether at that kind of early hour your little one might be a bit chilly. So is it about putting the heating on and just making sure that the room isn't super cold? Now the optimum sleep temperature, as I've sort of mentioned before, is between 16 to 21. So you do have a bit of a range in that, but just think about that. And don't worry if your little one's extremities, so like their hands, are kind of cold, because it's all about their internal body temperature. So, you know, the back of the neck is a good one to sort of test to see if they're warm, and if they're cold to touch, then you might need to put the heating on or consider what's going on there. So yeah, the kind of the darkness and the temperature is a thing. Using something like white noise, whatever age, if you're trying to make these changes, if even if you've got an older one, don't be afraid checking white noise in. Make sure it's on consistently. Make sure it's on at a conversational level so they can have it in their environment. All of those things are important. And then you want to think about why it's happening. So moving on from the environment, why is your little one waking early? Are they just kind of out of sorts? Are they just not really getting it? If you've got an older one, then it could just be that, you know, they need to reset their body clock. And one of the ways you can do this is by using a sleep training clock, or a clock. It doesn't even have to be a sleep training clock, really. So this is normally from the age of about 2 onwards, and it's either when your child can recognise the difference in the colour, or in colours, because the sleep training clocks, like the Grow clock, for example, have, you know, blue for night time and yellow for sunshine. So you want to sort of see if they can tell the difference between the colours. And if you've got an older child, you can just use like an LED clock and use the numbers, maybe cover up the minutes so that they're not kind of confusing them, but use the numbers to denote when it's morning. So we always talk about sort of 7 being morning. So when the 7 appears on the clock, you can tell them it's okay to get up. That's all fine. So think about putting that clock into him. And the reason to do that is you use it as a kind of a marker of when it's okay to get up. So you might want to think, and this might sound a little bit mad, think about setting it for when your child will wake up, so they can wake up and see that it's changed, and then you can celebrate that, and then you can move to maybe making it later and later and asking them to sort of stick with it. And the big thing around that with early rising is to really celebrate any kind of successes and make sure that they know they've done the right thing. Now obviously with little ones you can't necessarily do that, so I'd suggest if you've got a tiny one under the age of 2, then the key thing is going to be about trying to get their body just to stay a bit more sleepy. And so one of the things to do that is just to keep them in their room, because the minute you, well, arguably take them out the cot, but definitely the minute you take them out of the room and expose them to natural light or just get some movement, they're going to start thinking it's daytime. So you're telling the body that it's daytime at that time, and our body clock, which is called like our circadian rhythm, will know that. And so the longer you can leave it in the darkness in a more sedentary way, and this is not, you can go in and be with them, I'm not saying you leave them necessarily. If they're okay, leave them. If they're upset and you need to go to them, go to them, but keep them in that space for as long as you can. I mean, you know, I can easily say in words, then you could keep them in there till like 6 o'clock in the morning. If you stay consistent with that, the body might just start to learn that it doesn't get up until that point, and therefore it will naturally fuel its wake up to be later rather than the kind of the early one. So that's a sort of a again, a slightly softer one, because you're not necessarily doing too much about that. You can get into that kind of stricter regime of leaving them for a bit. That might mean some crying. If you're not comfortable with that, don't have to do it. It's just about how you're going to kind of make those changes and help them to understand that they've got to stay asleep for longer. But aside from kind of what happens in that morning mark, and actually once you decided it's morning, you should make a big song and dance of it being morning. You know, draw open the curtains, hopefully it's light by then, and take them downstairs and do your morning kind of activities. That's the key thing, to make that change obvious, that it's now no longer night time, we're into morning time. And again, that helps the body and them just recognise that that's the time to kind of start doing it. So yeah, think about that from your point of view. Then we need to think about the sleep pressure. And so this is the sort of the tweaky thing, the thing that we can manipulate so that your little one will feel more tired or potentially push them further and to sleep longer the night. Most early rising, I'll just put this out there first, most early rising is something to do with what's happening in the daytime and how that's transferring into the night. So we talk a lot about overtiredness being the key driver of early rising. That's just because they go to bed overtired, they struggle a little bit, and then as they get towards the morning, that struggle kind of stays with them, with the hormones that are kind of secreted as you get closer to morning. So you want to think about how your child is showing signs of tiredness during the day and also towards bedtime. So if they're super overtired or if they're showing signs of tiredness, I'd stick with an earlier bedtime. I've talked about this before. So you want to kind of go with a perhaps even 6 o'clock bedtime if you're really suffering. So go with an early bedtime to get them to settle, and then see if that helps. So you need to do this for about 5 days to see if it actually really helps. But get them to settle at that earlier time, avoid the overtiredness, and then support them through the kind of the early waking, as I talked about. So either staying with them or asking them to respect a clock of sorts. So all of those, that kind of action can help. Now you also have to consider what's going on in the day. So if your little one's still napping, you might want to think about what that level of tiredness is like, because if they're not sleeping enough, and if you, for example, got a child that was waking at 6, now waking at 5, and you're still putting them to bed at 7, they're losing an hour of sleep, so they might need to sleep a little bit more. But assess that versus their tiredness rather than kind of making a blanket kind of statement, because it might not be that, and actually it might be that you need to push completely in the other direction, which is the kind of the next step to do that. So if you've got to probably middle of this week, so maybe tomorrow, and your little one still isn't sort of transferring their early mornings through to kind of a normal time, then maybe it's time to sort of do a little bit more pushing. And it's kind of that sort of, I suppose in a way, that last ditch attempt to sort of see, not last ditch because there's always something else you can do, but that sort of push to make sure that you're trying to help them to sleep for longer. And that's by stretching their tiredness. So in my advice last week, I was talking about kind of making that bedtime sort of 6:30, which would have been 7:30 in old money, for 4 days and then going back to normal. So I would definitely advocate kind of doing that if you're still suffering after perhaps tonight, and see kind of if that helps. So that might mean putting their bedtime back to 7, or if you stayed at static bedtime, maybe putting it later. And I would do that responding to what they show in terms of their tiredness signs. So if they are not super tired, then perhaps you can push it a little bit. If they are kind of quite tired, then you might still want to push it, but you take that kind of on board with what you're doing. So, you know, I often talk about responsive measures, and I'm very, big fan of holistic, responsive parenting. But sometimes when we're kind of trying to get over what are essentially these artificial bumps, we need to push a little bit in that direction. So this is kind of one of the things you might need to do, is to sort of put them to bed later, so that you're pushing their tiredness levels to a greater extent, and then you can obviously see how that goes, because what you don't want to see is them waking more in the night, and you don't want that waking to either get earlier or stay static. So really, in summary, it's kind of all about checking out the environment that they sleep in, making sure it's nice and dark, white noise on, they're not too cold. It's about setting their body clock up to respect the fact that 6 o'clock arguably is the earliest time, and you can do that for older children through using like a clock and making that later and later, or for younger children you can look at just keeping them in their room, not leaving them to cry, going in if you want to. If you can leave them for a bit and you're happy with that, cool. And just keeping them in that dark sleep space as close to sort of 6 o'clock, or what's acceptable with you, as kind of possible. And then it's about sort of tweaking the kind of the bedtime, perhaps earlier, perhaps later, to see if that's going to help increase the sleep pressure and do that. Now, through all of that, it should all be about a sort of a journey to improvement, not a kind of a negative impact on it all. So be conscious of that, and if you see anything really affecting you, then obviously I'm here to kind of help, and you can happily get in touch, and we can look at booking a call in. I can take a big view of it all. So yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to mention. Often it's really just a waiting game, so it's really important that you remember, as with many things, these are phases, but you can make changes along that journey to help you out and to make sure that you're looking at all the different aspects of things, and that's that kind of holistic view to it all. But realistically, within a few days you should be back on track, and if you're not, then there's probably something else going on which might be worth talking about. So yeah, if you've got any kind of questions on it, just let me know. I will be talking about this all week probably, because it's that time of year, and I'm very happy to do so, because I've seen some pretty tricky times for people to wake up. But thanks very much for joining me. I appreciate you all showing up. Have a lovely rest of the day, and good luck with your early rising. I hope it balances out soon. Take care. Bye bye.